blasphemy is really not one of those things that we think too much about. And yet it is the crime that Jesus is being convicted of. A crime so severe, they thought it warranted the death penalty. We may not think about blasphemy too much here in America, but other countries still do. For example, a Pakistani Christian woman was accused of blasphemy after getting into an argument with co-workers. She was convicted and sentenced to death. She was on death row for 8 years before being acquitted in 2018. Thursday of Jesus' last week began with the Last Supper. Following the Last Supper, he and his disciples sang a hymn and walked out to the Mount of Olives. It was on this walk that Jesus predicted not only that Peter would deny him, but all the disciples would desert him that evening. This was followed up by Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane while the disciples slept. It was probably late Thursday evening. It may have even been the early morning hours of Friday, if it was past midnight, that Judas led the temple guard into the garden and betrayed Jesus with a kiss. Following Jesus' arrest, there's a series of trials that go throughout this night, late Thursday night, even if it is after the hours of midnight, and continue Friday morning. The number of trials vary depending on the gospel. In our series of this Worst Week Ever, we've been following the Gospel of Matthew, which looks at 2 trials. The trial that happens late Thursday night with the Jewish religious leaders called the Sanhedrin, and then actually a civil trial that happens with the Roman governor Pilate, and that'll happen Friday morning. So we're picking up the story this late Thursday night in Matthew chapter 26, and this is just after the arrest of Jesus, which was covered in our video last Wednesday. And we're going to pick up the story in verse 57, and we're going to read through verse 68. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas the high priest, where the teachers of the law and the elders had assembled. But Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. The chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus, so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward and declared, "This fellow said, 'I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man, sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? Look now, you have heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. Then they spit in his face and struck him with their fist. Others slapped him and said, "Prophesy to us, Messiah. Who hit you?" Matthew wants us to see the injustice that Jesus faced. But more than that, he wants us to see why Jesus willingly faced that injustice. Let's look at Jesus' bold witness and the response of the Sanhedrin. The first part of Jesus' bold witness is his silence. Jesus' silence in the trial is a witness to its injustice and to his submission to the will of God. Jesus' silence during this and the following trial served multiple purposes. But before we look at the trial itself, let's look at Peter. At the beginning of our passage, in verse 58, Peter followed him at a distance, right up to the courtyard of the high priest. He entered and sat down with the guards to see the outcome. Remember how just a few hours early, how brave Peter was? When Jesus said that all of the disciples would desert him later that evening, Peter said, well, maybe these others, but not me. And Peter is still trying to show a brave face. He has, in the back of his mind, Jesus had told him, before this night is over, you're going to deny me 3 times. But he's still thinking into himself, no, I can do this. And so he's somewhat brave, at a distance at least. All the disciples have fled, and that even included Peter in the heat of the action. But now he's kind of pulled himself together, and he's following Jesus. He's following the soldiers. He wants to see how this plays out, but he's staying at a distance. We know that the trial stretched throughout the night because the rooster crowing, that signifies Peter denying Jesus 3 times, is also going to signify the break of day. So as we look at Jesus' silence in the trial, it protested the injustice of the trial. You don't hold a trial in the middle of the night unless you're trying to hide something. Just imagine the police coming and arresting someone at 2 a.m., and the very next thing they do is rush to the courthouse and knock on the door and say, we need a judge right now. We need to put this person on trial this instant. That just wouldn't happen. If they rush to the courthouse at 2 a.m., they're going to find the doors locked. It's outside of business hours. You don't do things by the cover of night unless you're trying to pull one over on somebody, unless you're trying to hide something. This was not a popular uprising. This is a concerted effort by the religious leaders to get rid of Jesus. They were barely able to scrounge up enough witnesses to make their case. Verses 59 and 60, the chief priest and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for false evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death. But they did not find any, though many false witnesses came forward. Finally, 2 came forward. So this is a concerted effort by the religious leaders, and they're having a struggle just piecing together enough witnesses, even false witnesses, that are competent enough to make the case that they're trying to make. The Sanhedrin was, you could describe it as the Jewish Supreme Court. It had 70 members. Now, it's likely in this hastily thrown together, middle-of-the-night court that not all 70 were present. 23 members was enough to make a quorum. And even though they were the Jewish Supreme Court, their authority was mainly with religious matters. Outside of that, their authority was very limited because the Romans ultimately had control over the judicial system. These witnesses that they are able to get to come forward, what they accused Jesus of saying in verse 61, this fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days. Well, they are trying to come up with whatever they can to discredit Jesus. This is close to something that Jesus says, but it's a distortion of what Jesus said in John chapter 2, verses 19 to 21. Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you are going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple he had spoken of was his body. So the chief priests are doing their best to form a case against Jesus, But they're doing this in the middle of the night. They are doing it when no one can look at it, no one can challenge the proceedings. You'll remember earlier in the week, on Tuesday of Jesus' last week, is when the chief priests began plotting how they were going to arrest Jesus and execute him. And Kyle covered that on one of our Wednesday videos. And you'll remember from that they were having to be crafty about this because they feared that if they just ran up to Jesus and arrested him, that they could cause a riot. So Jesus' silence is a form of protest to show that this is not a real trial, that this is a miscarriage of justice. It also demonstrates his submission to the will of God. Jesus' silence does show his contempt for this miscarriage of justice, but more significantly, it shows his willingness to submit to God's will and his willingness to die for you. Imagine if we had been Peter, or with Peter standing in the courtyard. We would have been wishing that Jesus would stand up for himself. When these people make these accusations against Jesus, we've been saying, Jesus, come on, say something, anything, to stand up for yourself. But Jesus opened his mouth not. And the reason he opens his mouth not is because he loves you. And he is willing to die for you. The Lord Jesus Christ is so in love with his people that he will not stand in the way of an injustice done to his own person so that he can lay down his life on your behalf. Finally, this silence was a fulfillment of prophecy. We read in Isaiah 53:7, "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth." He was not just fulfilling Scripture, he's showing his heart of love for you. So silence forms one part of Jesus' bold witness. The second part of Jesus' bold witness is his response to the questions of the high priest. Jesus answers under oath, and his answer is clear and unmistakable. It's a claim to messiahship and deity. So I want to break that apart a little bit. His answer is not ambiguous. Let's look at the answer that he gives in verse 64. So the chief priest asks, "Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus answers, "You have said so," Jesus replied. "But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One, and coming on the clouds of heaven." Oftentimes, when we read our English translations, we think maybe Jesus is giving an ambiguous answer. He starts off saying, "You have said so." Jesus is not giving an ambiguous answer. The Jews at the time would have clearly understood that he was claiming to be the Messiah. Now, at this point in history, there had been a long string of revolutionaries who claimed to be the Messiah. And they were all political revolutionaries. They were all trying to overthrow whatever government was oppressing the Israelites at the time. And this is who the chief priest thinks that Jesus is claiming to be. He thinks he's one more in this string of revolutionaries claiming to be the Messiah. But Jesus' claim goes beyond what the chief priest is even accusing him of. The chief priest is saying, "Do you claim to be the Messiah?" And he's basically, "Do you claim to be another one of these revolutionaries trying to overthrow the government?" If he could catch Jesus saying, "Yes," then he could take it to the Roman court saying, "Look, He's trying to overthrow the government, and that is something that the Romans would be willing to try him for. But Jesus' answer goes further. He says, "Not only am I the Messiah, but I am God." No wonder the chief priest, in response to this, when Jesus gives this answer, tears his clothes. If Jesus was being ambiguous, this is not the way that he would have responded. You couldn't find a more clear and unmistakable claim to Jesus' messiahship and deity. It's sad that many today can't quite figure out who Jesus thinks he is from their reading of the Gospels. It's so sad because even the Sanhedrin was able to figure that out. They didn't believe it, but they were able to figure it out. Jesus is making an unmistakable claim to deity. So we've looked at Jesus' bold witness in this trial. Lastly, let's look at the response of the Sanhedrin to Jesus' witness. The Sanhedrin got the message, but they chose the wrong response. Every human being must come to grips with Jesus' claim that he was God. There are only two possible responses. You either defy that claim, or you submit to it.